Is this really the gaslighting that we're going to be seeing from the government going forward?
Well, I mean, it would follow the trend of previous years, wouldn't it?
Ladies and gentlemen, this morning, Mark Carney announced that he has the be-all and end-all of solutions for our grocery problems in Canada. He has announced that he's going to take Jagmeet Singh's grocery rebate and add to it. That's the solution for everybody. Meanwhile, Canadians have the largest food inflation in the G7, and we have inflation on the rise in general across the board, despite Mark Carney trying to tell everybody that it's easing. Mark Carney himself says that we are paying higher food inflation, but inflation is also easing. Joining us to talk about this and what their take is on this approach to helping Canadians during these difficult times is Franco Terrazzano of the Canadian Taxpayer Federation. Franco, welcome back.
Hey, always a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
So, anything is better than nothing. I guess we can say that. And even Carney's proposed and implemented tax reduction that he put forth at the beginning of his parliament, in one respect, you can't complain because it is a tax cut, so that's a good thing. And the problem is, the issue with that, though, is it didn't go far enough, in our humble opinion, especially on the heels of him raising taxes, raising EI, and all of this to offset the tax cut that he is so proud of. So with regard to the measures that they've announced this morning, what's your take, and how does the Canadian Taxpayer Federation view this?
Well, I love the way you summed it up. And I'll go to the first point first. Certainly, this is not a complete solution to the affordability crisis that we're still facing. Come on. Yeah, shocker, right? Water is wet in other news. I think I come at it from the same way that you just explained it. It's good that 30% of Canadians will get some relief, but 100% of Canadians pay too much taxes, right? And the government is finally acknowledging that cutting taxes makes life more affordable, but instead of sending checks to some Canadians, the government should be cutting spending and giving all Canadians major tax relief, right? Canadians are paying way too much tax. For context here, it's just about 30% of Canadians that will get any benefit at all from this, right? Increase the GST credit. And also too, right? If you look at the average Canadian family, we're not talking about the monopoly man, just the average Canadian family is paying more than 40% of its budget in taxes to all levels of government. Think about how crazy that is, right? And if we weren't already living in this reality, and you told somebody that the governments are going to take more than 40% of your paycheck through all these different taxes, they would look at you and think that you're insane, right? Canadians are so overtaxed that sure, we are happy that people who are struggling, 30% of Canadians are going to get a little bit of relief, but all Canadians need major tax relief.
Well, and this is the bizarre thing when I think about this. So Carney tried to talk about the fact that Canadians are getting hit hard at the grocery store, which is not news to any Canadians. He also almost tried to make it seem like they were paying a lot of GST on food, which we don't. We only pay GST on and HST on the processed stuff. So that I found was an interesting way to frame it. He didn't talk about the fact that we have the highest food inflation of all the G7 countries, but then went on to say, "Oh, it's not COVID this time. It's supply chain, it's geopolitical events." So they keep moving the goalposts in terms of these excuses as to what is causing food inflation in Canada. But to your point, why don't they just cut taxes a little bit across the board, and that way you save every day versus having to wait every quarter to get the allowance from Mr. Carney, handing it out to us poor folk?
This does not actually address the real issues, right? This does not actually address the structural issues here in Canada that are making life more expensive, right? Even if we just talk about grocery prices, why don't we talk about the carbon taxes that the federal government imposes and that makes life more expensive? Like, Carney canceled the consumer facing portion of the carbon tax, right? The one that smacked you in the face every time you got your heating bill or you paid at the gas station. But we're still paying two different types of carbon taxes, right? There's that industrial carbon tax, the carbon tax on Canadian businesses, and that hits things like fertilizer plants, right? So carbon taxes on fertilizer plants drives up costs for farmers and also makes groceries more expensive. But then there's this other carbon tax, again, a hidden carbon tax in fuel regulations that drives up prices of gasoline and diesel, right? So think about it. That big rig truck driver, when they're fueling up with diesel, that makes it more expensive to bring everything to the store, which makes it more expensive every time we buy anything from the store. So again, like, I'm happy that these low, modest income Canadians, about 30% of Canadians, are going to get a little bit of relief here. But this doesn't go even close enough to addressing the root issue of why everything is so expensive here in Canada.
But the Liberals told us in question period that those are imaginary carbon taxes.
And not just in question period, guys. So the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, a couple months before the government canceled the consumer carbon tax, literally a couple months, we were in the House of Commons, we were in the parliamentary committee testifying, and there was a Liberal backbencher who had the gall to tell us that she wasn't even aware of any carbon taxes in Canada. And then a couple months later, you have these other Liberal MPs at a gas station filming a video taking credit for ending the carbon tax.
Yeah, wow. and this is the gymnastics, and they should really look on their own Liberal website, because it's actually there, and the carbon pricing, and it's in there. But this is how they try and get around it, right? They rely on the semantics of it. Is there technically a carbon tax that you will see on your receipt? No. The problem is they implement this complex system of carbon credits that they'll have to buy and trade and all of this, but that costs them real dollars, and then they pass that cost down to the Canadians, and that's where this carbon tax comes into play. But because it doesn't function as a traditional tax, the Liberals would try to gaslight everybody and say, well, there is no carbon tax.
Let's talk about the political comms of all this, right? Because I listened to Carney's press conference. Okay. And in there, he said something almost similar to exactly this. He said, the pandemic caused inflation.
The pandemic caused inflation to spike worldwide, pushing up those costs of groceries and essentials, including rent.
Okay. The pandemic didn't cause inflation, right? Just the pandemic by itself absolutely did not cause inflation. What caused inflation? Well, you had revolving government lockdowns for I don't know how many years, but the big one is you had the Bank of Canada, the central bank, printing hundreds of billions of dollars out of thin air, largely financing Ottawa's deficits, and then dropped all that new money, all that new fiat dollars into an economy that was going through these revolving lockdowns, right? So the government, through the central bank, largely financing Ottawa's massive deficits, created the perfect storm for inflation. Too many dollars chasing too few goods. And look, these politicians are doing what politicians always want to do, right? They always want to blame something else. Oh, it's this person's fault. It's this business's fault. It's this supply chain shock. It's this thing out of our control. But the reality is, while there's different things that factor into prices day in and day out, the reason that the cost of living in Canada is out of control is because the cost of government in Canada is out of control.
And why specifically are grocery prices out of control?
That's a really good question. Look, one of the people that I like to go on matters of like food pricing is the food professor, right? Sylvain Charlebois. And I read a recent article from him in the Toronto Sun, and he mentions that it's policy-driven food inflation, or at least a good chunk of the inflation is policy-driven. And actually, I had him on the Canadian Taxpayers Federation show, and I asked him about the carbon taxes. And he was talking about how the carbon taxes that are still in place today are one of the factors that are driving up food prices here in Canada. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of different factors that go into play, but as we've kind of already mentioned, right, on the one hand, you have the government imposing carbon taxes on fertilizers, on refineries. You have the other hidden carbon tax and fuel regulations driving up gasoline and diesel. Obviously, the carbon tax throughout the supply chain trickles down and eventually hits us every time we go to the store or a grocery store, for example. But one other element I want to bring back to this, because it's goes back into this whole narrative of government spinners, political spinners. The government essentially breaks your leg, then gives you a crutch that's 2 sizes too small and expects a big fat thank you note, right? The government causes the problem. Then the government tries to create a solution to that problem. And a lot of times a solution just exacerbates the problem that the government created in the first place.
Well, and it's interesting you bring up Sylvain Charlebois, because we saw that he had a take on this morning's announcement as well. And his thought is that, yeah, this is all fine and dandy, but why not just cut taxes to begin with? Because what you're doing now is you're going to be, again, dumping a bunch of money back into the system, and you're just going to be causing further inflation. Do you agree with that?
I'm not sure about, well, I agree with his central theme, right? Cut out the middleman. Like, how about you just stop taking so much money in the first place, right? Like, I certainly agree with the central theme of it, right? Like, cutting taxes is the right idea. Canadians certainly need a lot more than just a bigger GST credit, right? Instead of, providing a higher GST credit for 30% of Canadians, why don't you just cut the GST and benefit all Canadians? So I certainly agree with the food professor when it comes to that. In terms of inflation, that's a good question. And honestly, I think a lot of it depends on how the government finances this deficit spending, right? Because we're already looking at a deficit of about $80 billion. Nowhere in the budget did I see this GST credit increase in the budget that was just presented in November. So I think a lot of the question on how this influences inflation really ends up depending on how the government ends up financing its massive deficits.
Well, and this comes back to the warnings from the Parliamentary Budget Office of the fact that government never, ever, ever hits their targeted deficit. They always overspend. And this was where they were sounding alarm bells for a deficit of this size, because even Justin Trudeau, he forecasted a $40 billion deficit and then went upwards of $62 billion in deficit. So at an $80 billion deficit, does that mean we're going to be actually spending $100 billion? And all of that prints more money, dumps it into the system, makes everything more expensive. And then Canadians are left wondering why are food prices going up? Because that's the challenge with the grocery stores, is because they maintain not a dollar a dollar type of a profit margin that they follow. They manage a percentage, like most businesses will. So as the value of a dollar goes down,
yep,
the number of dollars in that percentage of profit actually goes up. And that's what we're seeing. So like, because 10% of $10 is $1, but 10% of $100 is $10. So no wonder you're seeing all of the politicians say, oh, well, grocery stores are making X amount of profits and record profits. Well, no kidding. It's a completely different economy than it was 6 years ago, because the value of the dollar is basically half of what it was.
That's exactly right. Right? The steady drumbeat of higher prices throughout the entire economy can only come from one thing. Only one thing. And that is the printing press. Right? It is the new dollars, or too many dollars chasing too few goods. Like, that's where it comes from. And that's what we saw where the central bank, the Bank of Canada's printing press, was on overdrive during the heart of the pandemic. I mentioned this, but they printed more than $300 billion of new dollars right out of thin air. And think about it this way, right? The government, through its central bank, can print new dollars right out of thin air with the click of a keypad, right? But you can't print up farmland out of thin air. You can't print up new homes out of thin air. You can't print up more cars, more gasoline, more computers out of thin air, right? So when the government uses a central bank to essentially finance its deficits, we saw the central bank print up huge amounts of money during the heart of the pandemic. Well, that is creating the inflation tax. Now let's talk about how to get out of this, right? What must be done? Well, there's two things. There's only two ways, really. Well, three ways. Number one, don't print money. But number two, you have to produce more of the stuff that money buys. Right? You have to get Ottawa out of the way to allow our job creators, our businesses, to actually create things, to create the stuff that money buys, to develop our natural resources. And finally, the last thing is that the government has to get its financial house in order, right? You can't be borrowing $80 billion a year. And not to mention, folks, we're in 2026. We're years after a pandemic. Like, what are we doing here? Does the government just plan on borrowing more money on everything forever?
Well, and this this comes full circle back to the tariffs, because in order to produce more, in order to earn more, we need to be able to make money on that. And where do 75% of our exports go? To the United States of America. Like it or not, that's where they go. But Carney doesn't like talking about that. He just likes talking about the fact that China is our number 2 trading partner. But the one thing I want to ask you about is our inflation artificially low? And what I mean by that is, in looking at the consumer price index, you have sky high housing inflation and food inflation, but really, really low in the negatives when it comes to furniture and clothing and things like that. So what that says to me is that this is almost an illusion of a stable inflation that Mark Carney would have us believe, because what it means to me is we don't have any disposable income anymore, and that's why nobody is buying clothing and furniture and things like that. So therefore, those prices are decreasing to try to get people to buy them, whereas we're paying far more for the essentials. So the average of all that looks like it's good news, but is it really?
No, that's actually a really good point, right? And this is why, decades ago, inflation wasn't thought of as consumer price index or consumer prices increasing, right? Inflation in economic terms was, signaled an expansion of the monetary supply of the money. Like that's what inflation used to be referred to when you were talking about with economists decades ago, right? It's only now where inflation has become synonymous with the consumer price index, consumer prices going up. And the reason it used to be, when you talk about inflation, you talked about monetary inflation, is because that is what drives up, the cost of living going higher, right? That's what counteracts what prices would be doing, i.e. going down as the economy expands. Okay, but another thing to take note of, and this is a little bit less wonky, but I think something everyone needs to understand. So when you hear in the media that inflation might be going down, that doesn't mean that prices are going down. That could just mean that the year over year increase wasn't as high as it was the previous year, right? So what was it, 2022, when we had a 40-year high inflation? And then the following year, inflation was going up, but it wasn't as high. And you saw the media say inflation is going down. That doesn't mean prices are going down. Prices were still going up. They just weren't rising as fast as what they were during a 40-year high price increase. Do you see what I'm saying? And speaking of creative accounting, if we will, you also have the government, maybe not intentionally, but in effect, manipulating economic data, right? When the federal government adds 100,000 extra government employees, when they increase the number of government bureaucrats by 38%, yet total employment only goes up by 17%, all the additional government bureaucrats and government jobs makes the economy look like it's doing better than what it actually is doing.
Well, and this is where it all comes back to, what are we doing here? In that press conference, if anyone has the stomach to watch it, all I heard was, well, we're doing all this wonderful things. Just wait. And here's a bone to bridge, right? He kept using that term. We're going to give you a handout to bridge you until we reach the land of Shangri-La, where, we're going to have the most amazing economy on the planet. Meanwhile, how do you have the most amazing economy on the planet when you're trying to actively distance yourself from the most amazing economy on the planet, which is the United States of America? I don't see how you can have one without the other. And, is this really the gaslighting that we're going to be seeing from the government going forward?
Well, I mean, it would follow the trend of previous years, wouldn't it? Right? like, oh, don't worry, folks, the carbon tax will make you more rich. Or, oh, yeah, the CBC doesn't hand out bonuses. They're performance pay. Right? So this is kind of something we've had to, sniff through for quite some time here at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Let's just put it that way. But, speaking of the bigger picture on economics, look, more government is not the solution. We're at a time and point in Canada where too much government is the problem, right? I mentioned this. Take nearly half of your paycheck, rip it in half, because that's the tax man's. Where more than 40% of the average Canadian family's budget is going to taxes, where the average Canadian family, the biggest expense for the average Canadian family, it's not the home they live in, right? It's not the food they eat. It's not the clothes they buy. It's the taxes they're forced to pay to all levels of government, right? Where we rank behind the United States on both income tax competitiveness and business tax competitiveness, right? The solution everyone who is willing to be honest already understands the solution. Maybe not the politicians, maybe not the taxpayer funded bureaucrats, but everyone who is like willing to look at this with a straight and clear eye already knows the solution. And it's for the government, in particular Ottawa, to get out of the way.